Hello, welcome to my video. In this video, I'm going to talk about some of the for-fee things that you can enable once you onboard your not Azure servers via the Azure Arc service to Azure. And so my last video, I talked and focused on the for free features, and there were a lot of them that we discussed in that video, which we showed that just simply by onboarding your servers, Windows and Linux servers to Azure Arc, lots of really useful and cool things you get with no charge. In this one, I want to focus on the services, or rather, at least the core services that once you Arc enable servers and bring them into Azure, that you can take advantage of for fee or for a price, for a meter. So I'll start with this, like I did last time. I've got this slide here, and as you can see, there are essentially 5 what I'll call core services or things that you can turn on and enable, and your Arc enabled servers, once you onboard them to Azure via Arc, you can start taking advantage of. And I want to be clear that, and like I did in the last video as well, that the none of these things just happen by default, and that's a good thing, because we don't want to just assume that you want to use Defender and Monitor and Sentinel, etc., because they do come with a fee. Once you configure and turn these on, they will start charging you a bill for their services. So what I want to do is just kind of go through the 5. I can't really exhaustively go through the ins and outs of all these. Most of these are their own topic, in that having the proper way to enterprise deploy and use things like Sentinel and Defender and even policy, etc., are topics all of their own. My point is just to kind of introduce that once I Arc enable, try to answer the question, well, what if, and also at least at a high level, what is this going to cost, or what does this look like? How do we charge for these services when and if I do decide to turn them on? Okay, so let's get started. So as you can see here, I've got this slide here, and there's, essentially there's 5 things. And so if you take away what are the things that I can do, these are primarily what most people do. They'll do one or a few or sometimes all of these for their Arc enabled servers. Also notice that a lot of these, and I'll keep coming back to this, is that the whole point of Arc is to make not Azure servers look like native Azure things. And so when we walk through this, the theme that we'll keep coming back to is how we use these services against our regular native Azure estate, such as native Azure VMs and services, is very consistent. It's not like I have to go to another portal or do things much differently. Even the command lines, the API, the GUI, and the portal that support the configuration of these things, the only difference is that we have this thing called an Arc-enabled server versus just a Azure VM, right? But in the end, they're all servers. And so we'll get a taste of that as well. And so here they are: Microsoft Defender for Cloud, Azure Monitor, Microsoft Sentinel, Azure Update Manager, and Azure Policy. All of these things are things that, of course, you can take advantage of for your native Azure services, such as VMs and even other PaaS services within Azure. But now I can take advantage of them for my Arc-enabled things. And so let's start with Defender. So in Defender, again, I have links here for this. So underneath these, in my blog entry, I'll make sure that the entries are there as well. So when you click on those, you'll be able to pull up the pricing pages. So, and I know this is, I'm a technical person, and my least favorite topic is talking about costs and how to do the options, but it is usually inevitably what most people want to know about pretty close to right off. So I want to open up with that. So for example, when we talk about Defender, we'll just start here. The pricing page will outline, well, what does this cost? And a lot of times there is some delineation, I'll point that out, but as far as, when I turn on Defender, I have, Microsoft Defender Plan 1 or Plan 2. For my servers, the same meters apply. So as far as we have Arc-enabled servers, they're pretty much consistent with the same way we would price and meter for our Azure things. The only difference is if we look at, and I think it's listed here, for Microsoft Defender for SQL outside Azure. And so those would be your Azure Arc-enabled servers that are that happen to have a SQL instance, I can optionally turn that on and get even more Defender features for this SQL instance or instances on my Arc-enabled servers. This is a little different, so we do have a meter charge. It's a different meter charge than for those that are connected. Notice it's cheaper, and it's probably because there's a little bit more we can do if they're native Azure versus Arc-enabled, but there is a different meter for that if we're talking about Arc-enabled. Okay, so let's look at that, what this would look like for real. So if you were in my session, last session in my 4FEE, I'm going to go back to that same demo environment if I can find my portal window, and there it is. And if I look at you start with our Arc things, I can look at some of the machines. And, when I focused on the 4FEE things, I focused on the things that are there. And you'll notice that what I've done to this environment is I've lit up pretty much all of the things I can. And so these extra extensions such as MDE Windows, we'll talk about Azure Monitor, the AMA agent, is because I've enabled and I've configured my environment to use these 4FEE systems. So for example, now that I have things such as Defender lit up for the server, I can now get a view of what recommendations Defender will give me about that server. If I go to the Defender for Cloud area and I look at my views here, one thing, and again, Defender for Cloud is its own topic, but just to point out for our Arc-enabled stuff, our inventory essentially just now has our purple boxes, and these are our Azure Arc-enabled things sitting alongside our other things that we've decided to enable Defender for. And so that also brings up the other thing too. What I had to do this is not really any different than how I would enable it for my native Azure estate. So for example, in Defender, you basically define the plans and the types of plans that you wish to light up within typically your subscription, your management group at whatever level. And simply by you onboarding a server to Arc into that proper resource group and that proper subscription, the extension just happens. And assuming that, we've got in this case, I have plan 2 lit up and it's turned on. And then even the database stuff. So I mentioned that, what if my Arc-enabled machines, I've also done the SQL Arc-enabled stuff, right? Because I have SQL servers in my Arc-enabled servers. Well, what happens there? Well, if I simply have this turned on in my environment and inside my subscription where I land that Arc-enabled thing, if I go back to my, Arc-enabled machines and I pick on one of my SQL servers, you'll notice that even my SQL configuration, go here and I go for Defender, you'll see that it also has that lit up as well. And there's nothing really I had to do here. And again, that's kind of consistent with what it is. But again, just want to point out that probably one of the most popular ones, and why I put this top of the list, is Defender is typically I'd say probably arguably the first thing that most people will want to do, because they may have already deployed Defender for their Azure estate, and then this just brings in their not Azure estate, or as much as they can, the Windows and Linux servers and other clouds, as well as on-prem that are left there in that same estate using the same consistent service known as Defender. Okay. So moving on from that, so again, there's charges here. And again, these charges are the pay-as-you-go. There's lots and lots more details for these at those pricing pages, at those links. And so you can look at those there. But these are just street prices, not discounted, just basically to give you a relative idea of what the cost would look like for things like Defender, et cetera. So let's move on to Azure Monitor and Sentinel. Now, what's interesting about Monitor, and then Sentinel is a good example of this. So Azure Monitor, a lot of our things such as Defender, even Update Manager, and Sentinel itself, they essentially assume and rely on ingestion of data. That's how they work. That's what gives them informs them on how to give recommendations about maybe security exploits that are happening, or you're missing patches, or there's malware, et cetera. We ingest that data, and the main service we do that ingestion is this thing called Azure Monitor. And so Azure Monitor is a service. It's been around for quite a while in Azure, and a lot of times you might be using it in the background for certain things, or you can specifically create what's called your own log analytics workspace, and then create data collection rules, which basically tell anything that you've told your regular Azure VM servers or your Arc enabled servers, hey, send all your performance metrics or your inventory information or your tracking information about yourself. Where does it land? It lands in a log analytics workspace. And so how we charge for Azure Monitor is different. It is charged by the ingestion or per gig, as you can see. So about $230 retail, pay as you go. And a lot of people are like, well, that doesn't help me very much. How much is that going to cost? And it is at first kind of looks very daunting. How do you figure this out? The good news is that we offer a lot of things within the service itself that allow you to monitor the actual ingestion that's going on, so you can kind of get an idea of the average per day, so you can understand how much to, as you build the environment, how much to expect, and even things like capping the data. So if you're scared that you make a mistake and you've done a configuration that all of a sudden I've gotten hundreds of more gig per day in ingestion, and I'm going to get this big bill and it's going to be a surprise at the end of the month, we can put a cap on that as well. So let's take a look at that. So if I go back to my portal here, and let's start with, not with the Arc view, but let's do that. Since we're already here, we're on this particular server. Let's go back to the machine itself. Let's go to our 22 server. If I look at down the list here, if I have Azure Monitor turned on, my Arc server will now have this Insights monitoring pane should light up. So for both Linux and Windows. So I'll see some pretty, typically the basic, default rules, collection rules are, your basics of, bring us your CPU, memory, disk statistics, and I can start, as you can see, I can look at this over time as far as the CPU, memory, and disk usage, et cetera, of this particular machine. Pretty good, right? But what's even better is if I go to monitor, so if I just go to the monitor area of my subscription, and notice that, monitor is a lot bigger than just, hey, give me a server and I can get CPU metrics. It actually can, you can turn it on for your virtual machines, storage accounts, containers, all of these PaaS services within Azure itself, and even other data sources can be ingested as well from other clouds, et cetera. But here's what I find is interesting. When you look at virtual machines, and I go to the overview page, what you're looking at is not just, hey, what's the performance of my Azure VMs, virtual machines, but, well, virtual machines. And really, that's kind of a misnomer. This also does and will include all of your Arc-enabled systems, assuming that you've basically told them, hey, send your data to a log analytics workspace. So if I look through this, you can see that, by name, I've got, these are Arc-enabled systems, and if in this particular workspace I also had native VMs, they would sit alongside these same views. And the other thing too about Azure Monitor, which is interesting, is there's this in Azure. There's all these concepts of views. There's dashboards, but specific to things that land in a log analytics workspace. Workbooks are really, really powerful things, and workbooks are things that we have default workbooks that show like metrics, and again, this can be consistent with both across VMs as well as Arc-enabled servers as well, because they're just VMs from another place that's not Azure, but the data is consistent. But we can also, look at third-party, and there's actually a great GitHub repo out there. There's third parties. This is an example of one I just simply imported straight from a repo. All I had to do was just save the JSON that someone had built for this workbook. And notice that this workbook is like, hey, this is kind of a nifty thing I built for virtual machines, for vital signs. And well, what do you need? I need a log analytics workspace. I need Azure Monitor for VM enabled. That's good. And then I need to make sure these performance counts are collected. And I think I have that all set up. And once, once I do that, I can get all kinds of interesting views to, tailor it to my needs. And what's interesting is look at the names of these things. I didn't ask for, oh, these are Arc-enabled machines, so it's different. It's a different set of views and settings. These are, again, alongside your native Azure systems. And so you can get a look at, a heat map of sorts, like red, yellow, green, about like maybe certain disks are filling up. What's that look like? What's my red, yellow, orange, green? Maybe I've got, maybe I didn't know these servers were having disk issues, like they're too busy for their workload, those types of things, right? Again, it's a monitoring tool, and it opens up to your Arc things, your not Azure things as well. The other thing I want to point out is if I go back to one of my Arc systems, Azure Monitor, or at least the Log Analytics workspace, is more about, it's not just about performance, it's a lot of things. And as an example of that, one of the things you can do is you can also choose to turn on sending inventory information about not just your Azure VMs, because of course we can do that, but now that you have Arc enabled machines, I can do the same thing. So I can send all the inventory information to Log Analytics workspace, and I can get workbook views of that as well. As you can see, this is just showing this individual machine and the long list of all of the defined software packages that are being detected and continuously detected on this particular machine. And if I look at this view, this is an interesting view that's relatively new. I can look at tracking and inventory information for all of the things that I have within my Azure estate. But notice it's, again, the consistency. These are non-Azure means. These are Arc-enabled Windows Linux machines. Sitting alongside, I don't have much. I've got this one server that's also inventory tracking, and it just happens to be a native Azure machine. Again, they're servers, and so we should treat them as servers, whether they be wherever they sit and reside. They're important to you. They're sitting somewhere in your data center estate somewhere, Azure or non, and this allows us to bring that all together. Okay. And so that's Monitor. And one of the things I forgot to point out, so cost, and this is a big concern. I usually have conversations about, well, gee, I'm scared, I'm frightened to turn this on because if I screw up a rule and I maybe I turn some things on for too much time, then what happens? I get a big bill at the end, and my boss doesn't like me. So to try to solve against that, we can look at maybe some things that allow us to help us make sure we get a consistent cost or an expected bill, if you will. So what you're looking at now is the main Log Analytics workspace that I've defined, that most all my systems are sending their inventory information and performance metrics, and it shows you near real time, hey, what's the volume of data, what kind of data is this? But this is probably the most useful thing here in the settings. There's this estimated cost button, and so this lets you look at a daily running total, in this case the last 31 days. What's the average ingestion? And notice I got this big white spaces because in a demo environment I had it turned off, so it's actually showing you day to day. And so what this does, it allows you to inform things like this. I can actually set a daily cap. So this is important. It's like, well, I average maybe, let's say 250 meg a day. So maybe I'll do, no more, won't allow more than half a gig or 0.25 gig a day. And that way it'll alert me if it gets to the limit and I need to either up it or try to figure out, hey, maybe I did some misconfiguration. That also ties into Sentinel. And I'm not going to do, again, Sentinel is its own kind of category, but notice that if you have Sentinel lit up, and I do on this particular Log Analytics workspace, I would have to go over to the pricing tiers. And so for that, let me do this. I'll show you one of my other workspaces. If I go to usage, yeah, so this is the view. So what this does is it'll actually dictate over time. It'll say, you're on the pay-as-you-go tier, but over time, depending on ingestion, it may suggest that I flip to one of the committed tiers. And notice that you get discounts. So the more you commit to, that $2.30 per gig per month turns into something much less, depending on how big your enterprise is, right? So you can take advantage of those price tier commitments for your ingestion. So again, a way to control the ingestion and flow of that data. Okay, so again, Sentinel's the same way, and I'm not going to. Sentinel is essentially our SIEM, so it's our answer to doing things like some of the more traditional tools like Splunk have done. And so the thing I'll say about it is, well, look, you may already be using Defender for your Azure native things, and so now I can do it for Arc-enabled things. I can use Monitor now. I can use it for Arc-enabled things. Sentinel is just another thing. If I light up Sentinel, it'll attach itself to that Log Analytics workspace, and then I can use that as my SIEM to do hunting and things around trying to figure out security and event management and trending analysis of what's going on from a security perspective. And so it's just more ingested data. If I include Arc Enable, it's just there along for the ride. Again, there's really nothing for you to do. I onboard Arc and I point them to the proper log analytics workspace through the Azure Monitor agent deployment, and off we go. So the next thing is Azure Update Manager. So for the last couple of years, I'd say several years, we have had an update management capability within Azure. Within the last year, maybe year, 18 months, we actually have this, we'll call it version 2, known as Azure Update Manager. And so Azure Update Manager is an extension that I can use on my native Azure servers, but also now my Arc enabled servers. So now I can do Windows and Linux classified, updates, security or otherwise updates on a regular scheduled basis and see views of who's pending patches, who's not, etc. So if I take a look at that, if I go back to my portal here, and I'll just start from one of my Arc enabled machines. We'll pick on another one. Just do like say 2019 here. And if you have this enabled, you can look at its updates section, and it'll actually show you things about, hey, are you missing any updates? In this case, I've picked one that does have, it's missing the latest intelligence update from the last scan that it did. And what's interesting is I can set schedule, right? So I can say, in this case, you can sell like, well, it looks like every night at midnight, I do a scan, and if I need updates, I will install them and reboot as necessary. And how that's happening is I can apply what's called a maintenance configuration, an Azure Update Manager maintenance configuration. What's interesting about this is that just like Defender, or as we'll see with Monitor, or we have seen with Monitor and all these other things, if I look at my machines, well, machines are machines. So again, it's all about bringing together. I've got servers. Some of them are Azure, some of them are not Azure. I want to treat them with the same maintenance configuration, the same schedules, and with the same consistent console, such as you're seeing here. Azure Update Manager allows me to do that. Simply, I have to enable the Azure Update Management extension to my now onboarded Arc-enabled machines. And again, there is a price to it. What's interesting is there's a price for non-Azure. So for native Azure VMs, you can use AUM for free. It's just part of, use it or don't use it. It's kind of considered part of the value of you using Azure as your platform for your server. For Arc-enabled machines, we do provide there is a fee, about $5 server per month. And by the way, that's the other thing too. Notice that a lot of these are not, definite $5, $15. We do have a prorated basis on most of these, and again, details are in these links. But essentially, if your off-premise servers, maybe they're in Amazon or they're Google or they're on-prem and you turn them off during weekends or off hours, we actually will prorate the cost. So it's important to realize that some of these have hourly or daily prorates. So the worst case scenario would be about $5 per server per month for an Arc-enabled Azure Update, managed Arc-enabled machine. And last but not least, we have policy. And so again, policy is one of those things, kind of like Monitor. There's a lot of services and things you might do in your Azure subscription for your Azure things that you might be applying a policy and you may not actually be aware of it. And that's okay, because that's how it's supposed to work. But policy in and of itself is a way to do audits as well as even configuration management of Windows and Linux servers by applying one or more policy definitions or initiatives, which include a group of policy definitions. Now, Azure policy, you'll see it says here, well, at $6 server per month. And again, it's for Azure VMs or things that are in your Azure estate natively. There's no cost, there's no charge. For Arc-enabled machines, a lot of policies, again, there's no charge. So things that aren't necessary, that are basically necessary for things like outside the VM, like enforcing tags, or Azure tags, or doing things like just, hey, make sure these extensions are there. Those types of policies, if those are all you're doing to your Arc-enabled machines, you don't get a charge for those. We do charge for what we call guest configuration type of policies. So I'll show you kind of what I mean there. So if I go back into my Azure estate, and let's just start with one of my boxes. Let's go to this guy, I guess, this SQL box. And then if I look at policies, you'll see that I have various policies applied here. Some of these were done for me or on my behalf because I've introduced some other services, and some I've done intentionally. So for example, things that this initiative here, configure SQL VMs and Arc-enabled SQLs to install. So basically this essentially means that, look, I can set, and you should, in our CAF guidance and all of our best practices about how to create a good operating Azure estate, say that, hey, you should use policy to make sure that, hey, if this server lands here, if it notices that somebody forgot to, enable monitoring agent, or they pointed it to the wrong workspace, I can at least audit and show you that that's wrong. Or if it's not been deployed correctly, the policy can be set to actually invoke and enforce and actually make the configuration change, such as installing an extension that's needed for that particular thing to happen. That's all fine and good, but the one thing, again, going back to, well, what do we charge for? And again, if I look at policies and I look at all of the ones that are offered by Microsoft, like this library is basically just by default available to you. A lot of these policies really won't charge you anything unless you pick a policy that manipulates guest configuration. And so if I look at just the, guest configuration policies, I apply that here. These policies and ones like them that do guest configuration, some of the popular ones are things like security baselining stuff, which basically look at Windows and Linux security baselines to basically, and if so, you can have them, if they don't meet requirements, to enforce requirements or at least audit you. Those are considered that those are run inside guest because they have to do something, manipulate registry or files or the operating system itself within that guest. Those policies and that charge of $6 will, if you apply one or more of those types of policies to your Arc-enabled things, you'll see that charge, but otherwise you won't. And so if I go back to like my overview here, I don't have a whole lot going on because my environment's not real. It's just a demo environment, and it does have a few things that I've put in here, but not a whole lot. I slapped, without doing any prereqs, I slapped in the computer baseline. Like, this is a pretty several initiative one, and man, I'm failing. I'm 0 for 5, like the machines that I'm targeting, and there's many reasons why, and I can dig in and find those out in that audit only policy. And then I've also have this one that does tagging. So basically apply my favorite, the tags that I want to enforce so that I can, search for things, bill appropriately internally for things based on those tags, make sure that they're there. So there's a lot of things. And when you get up and going, policy is a very useful tool in general. And again, the point I'm making here is, hey, you Arc-enable those machines, that policy extension is just automatically already there. So it's up to you. If you wish to deploy and find useful things like guest configuration policies and apply those to your Arc-enabled servers as well as your native Azure VMs, well, we can do that now. Just keep in mind it is for fee if it is those guest configurations for those Arc-enabled things. And that's about it. So to wrap up here, again, there's, when you Arc-enable, it's all about bringing those into real first-class citizen type of Azure resources. So now they're Azure resources. These are the 5 things, the main things that we can take advantage of today. That's Defender for Cloud, enabling that, enabling up Azure Monitor for itself or some of the other services such as Microsoft Sentinel, Azure Update Manager, as well as Azure Policy, but specifically for guest configuration policy, and free for all the other ones that we have. And so that's all I had today. Thanks for listening.